It started as a minor inconvenience. A missing package here, a delayed delivery there. At first, Mark thought little of it. Online orders went missing all the time. Maybe the courier had dropped it off at the wrong address. Maybe porch pirates were just getting bolder in his quiet suburban neighborhood. But as the weeks passed, the pattern grew too deliberate to ignore. Packages would arrive in the afternoon, confirmed by tracking updates, only to vanish within an hour. The first time it happened, it was a set of replacement garden tools. Then a box of coffee beans. Then, oddly enough, a pair of socks. Nothing expensive, but frequent enough to sting. Mark tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but he began to notice something strange. His neighbor, Karen, always seemed to be outside around the same time his deliveries went missing. Karen was the sort of neighbor everyone tiptoed around. She had lived in the cul-de-sac longer than anyone and treated it like her personal kingdom. Her manicured lawn was her pride, her HOA rulebook her weapon, and her sharp tongue the neighborhood's most consistent noise complaint. She had an unshakable sense of superiority, the kind that made even casual encounters feel like interrogations. Mark had never clashed with her directly, until the packages. He began paying closer attention. Every time a delivery was due, he noticed Karen's blinds twitching or her stepping out to water her plants. When he casually asked the other neighbors if they'd experienced missing packages, most shrugged, but one mentioned something unsettling. A small pile of boxes had once been spotted in Karen's recycling bin, with labels torn off. That was when suspicion hardened into certainty. Determined to confirm it, Mark installed a small security camera above his front door. Discreet, angled just right to capture the porch and the sidewalk. The next delivery was scheduled for Friday, a new set of noise-canceling headphones. Nothing flashy, but valuable enough to tempt a thief. That afternoon, the package arrived right on schedule. Mark was at work but checked his phone to see the delivery notification. The box sat there neatly on the porch. A few hours later, another alert popped up, motion detected. He opened the live feed just in time to see a familiar figure walk into frame. Karen. She looked around cautiously, pretending to glance at her watch, then leaned over and scooped up the box as if it were her own. She didn't even hesitate. She tucked it under her arm, straightened her sunglasses, and strutted back toward her house like it was the most natural thing in the world. Mark's pulse raced. The footage was clear, undeniable. But rather than explode with anger, he felt a slow, simmering satisfaction. Now he had proof. Now he could do something more than just complain. That night, he reviewed the footage carefully, saving it in multiple copies, labeling each file with the date and time. He even printed still frames. The evidence was airtight. But before going to the police or the OA, he paused. If he reported her now, she might deny everything, play the victim, or claim it was a mix-up. Karen was clever, manipulative, and practiced in twisting stories to her advantage. If he wanted to expose her, he needed a plan. Not just proof of one theft, but a pattern so blatant that no one could defend her. So Mark waited. He kept ordering small, harmless packages, candles, stationery, household items. Every few days, something new would arrive, and like clockwork, it would disappear. Each theft was caught on camera. Karen's movements were always the same. Cautious at first, then increasingly bold. Within a week, she wasn't even pretending anymore. By the fourth missing package, Mark had more than enough evidence. But he wasn't ready to strike just yet. The footage alone would expose her, sure, but it wouldn't teach her anything, and it wouldn't be nearly as satisfying as seeing her face when the tables finally turned. That's when the idea for the trap took root. If Karen wanted to steal packages, she could have won, but not the kind she expected. He began researching glitter bomb devices, motion-activated trackers, and non-harmful but humiliating prank boxes. He found plenty of examples online from ex-engineers who designed them to catch thieves red-handed. It took a week of careful planning, late night assembly, and a few test runs in his garage, but soon he had the perfect decoy package. It looked ordinary, a medium-sized Amazon box complete with fake shipping labels. But inside was a device that would record video, release a cloud of bright neon glitter, and spray a harmless but incredibly smelly burst of skunk-scented fluid once opened. He wrapped it up neatly, marked it, electronics, handle with care, and left it prominently on his porch. Then he positioned his cameras, not one, but three this time, each catching a different angle: the porch, the sidewalk, and the path to Karen's house. It was the perfect bait. The following morning, Mark left for work as usual, though he barely focused on anything but the live camera feed on his phone. By noon, the box still sat there. By 2, a motion alert buzzed. His heart raced as he opened the feed. There she was again. Karen sauntered up to the porch like she owned the place, glanced briefly around, and lifted the package. She smirked, tucking it under her arm before heading straight back to her house. Mark watched her disappear inside, then switched to the second camera, the one pointed toward her living room window. Moments later, a flash of bright pink and gold glitter exploded into the air, followed by a flurry of movement. Then came the moment he'd been waiting for. The door burst open, and Karen stumbled out, coughing, covered in glitter, her hair and clothes shining under the sun like a disco ball. The smell must have been awful. She flailed her arms, gagging, trying to brush it all off. It was pure poetic justice, captured in high definition from 3 angles. Mark sat back in his office chair, smiling for the first time in weeks. He didn't rush to upload the footage or share it immediately. No, he wanted to savor it, to plan the reveal just as carefully as he'd planned the trap. For now, he simply saved the videos and labeled the files. Karen Trap 1. The name alone made him grin. Little did he know this glitter explosion was only the beginning. Because when Karen realized she'd been caught and humiliated, she wouldn't take it quietly. And soon, what started as a petty theft would spiral into a neighborhood war, unlike anything the HOA had ever seen. When the glitter exploded across Karen's living room, and the stink of the prank box began to seep through her curtains, the cold Sack did not simply laugh and move on. The viral moment Mark had engineered with surgical patience rerouted the neighborhood's attention into a vortex of opinion, outrage, and fuel for grudges. In hours, the footage he had patiently named and archived began to ripple through private message threads, then public posts, and finally the kind of shared clips that beckon neighbors who normally never left their porches. At first, the mood in Maplewood was elated. People who had quietly suspected Karen's pilfering felt vindicated. Parents texted one another about how cathartic it was to finally catch the petty tyrant with her hand in the metaphorical cookie jar. The local community group chat erupted with laughing emojis and suggestions that Mark should run for HOA president. Others, less keen on feuds, worried about escalation. Those worried voices were outnumbered, but they existed, and Karen noticed them. Humiliation lands differently for people used to authority. What most of the block saw as a comeuppance, Karen experienced as an existential breach. Her careful facade of composure cracked into something sharper and more deliberate. Where Mark had plotted and baited, she planned and pivoted. She was not the type to accept public ridicule and let it be the final word. The first salvo was bureaucratic and almost surgical in its detachment. A letter appeared on Mark's porch the next morning, an official-looking envelope that sparked a different kind of fear among homeowners who had seen HOA sanctions escalate before. It claimed that a complaint had been filed alleging harassment and harassment-adjacent property modifications, and suggested mediation. The tone implied process paperwork, the slow grind of officialdom, things that wear people down. The community's legalistic heart hummed into motion. Karen's playbook, refined by years of curating the neighborhood's appearance, relied on institutional leverage. She contacted the HOA board with measured phrases, complaining not directly about stolen packages but about disturbances and escalation of neighbor disputes. It was a tactical reframing, designed to obscure motive with formality. Board members who had been privately amused now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of referees, worried more about liability than right or wrong. Simultaneously, Karen cultivated sympathy. She began a soft campaign of grief, a selective airing of the humiliation on platforms that promised control of the narrative. She portrayed herself as a victim of a cruel prank that had somehow endangered children, complained about trespassing associated with all the sudden foot traffic around Mark's display, and emphasized decorum. Some neighbors who had no appetite for online spectacle accepted the story at face value. Rumors germinated that Mark had provoked her unnecessarily, that he'd engineered a trap that would later be used against him. The narrative fractured the street into small islands of allegiance. Mark, who had anticipated attention, had not banked on the speed of Karen's counteroffensive. He had expected petty retaliation but not the legal choreography she now attempted. He had, however, prepared a different sort of arsenal documentation. He had the timestamps, the angles, the metadata from the cameras. He had neighbors' testimonials about packages, and he had receipts proving the value and frequency of deliveries. He started quietly circulating a concise timeline to people he trusted, an airtight chronology of missing packages, captured footage, and the exact dates of Karen's suspicious appearances. The difference between compiled evidence and shouted accusation was what kept the peace for many on the block. Still, the conflict mutated. If Karen could not make the law tilt in her direction, she tried to make perception tilt. Anonymous posts cropped up on neighborhood pages, casting Mark as an attention seeker who'd set up his own packages for clicks. Someone had edited the footage circulating online to blur the detail that proved intent, and the altered clip was shared by a handful of accounts that had once favored Karen's critiques. Conspiracy threads spun out, and a few older residents, those who remembered quieter, more ordered days, began to murmur about decorum and respect. The mosaic of support started to look patchy. The burglary narrative that Mark had once pursued in private paperwork now had to become public strategy. He compiled his clips, added raw timestamp overlays, and posted an unassailable record to a community drive he controlled, not for grandstanding but for transparency. When neighbors clicked the folder, the story became clear. Identical angles, repeated visits, a pattern not of coincidence but of practice. That clarity shifted many skeptical opinions back toward his side. A small delegation of residents accompanied him to the next HOA meeting with printed pages, photographs of opened boxes recovered from Karen's recycling, and a petition demanding restoration of trust. Panicked by the documentation, Karen rerouted again. Her next move was personal and petty in equal measure. Mailboxes were found nudged sideways on Mark's morning walks. A delicate strip of solar lights lining the driveway, installed after the glitter incident to keep curious visitors respectful of boundaries, were snapped off their pegs and strewn into a drainage ditch. Small acts designed to annoy and to imply that Mark's new visibility had invited trouble rather than prevented it. The effects were micro-intimidation, 100 tiny irritants meant to fray nerves and make life unpredictable. When Mark discovered the sabotage, he did not rage into the public square. He logged it, repaired what he could, and filmed the cleanups. He also invested in visible, non-intrusive signage respectful requests for delivery drivers to ring the doorbell, a polite note about safety and neighborhood courtesy. Where Karen weaponized procedure, he weaponized transparency and public goodwill. Parents who had once walked past the drama now answered his posts with pictures of their kids retrieving packages safely. Small businesses that had stopped deliveries confirmed timeliness in comments. The tide of sympathy swelled again, but Karen escalated one more time in ways that were harder to map on the HOA rubric. A neighbor's Christmas garland was found shredded one morning. Another woke to a dog barking wildly as someone had left their gate ajar. The undercurrent became menacing, intimating that the conflict could spill beyond cardboard and glitter into the realm of real danger. Rumors pointed back to Karen's camp. Anonymous complaints, late-night recordings, a brief glimpse of her car on a security feed. The block, once insulated by civility, now experienced a slow erosion of trust. At that critical juncture, Mark stepped up his own community work in a way that made retaliation self-defeating. He organized a Saturday porch pickup, where neighbors could bring unclaimed parcels to a central, monitored table for safe collection. He did not advertise the crusade. The event was framed as neighborly convenience. And precisely because it was ordinary and helpful, it diffused much of the edge. People who had been tempted to gossip now had reasons to show up with baked goods or to pick up stray packages they had meant to hold for others. The gesture reframed Mark from provocateur to practical hero in the eyes of many on the block. That did not end the attacks, however. Legal threats arrived, letters drafted with the precise chill of a weaponized signature, that accused him of harassment and demanded that he stop recording and publishing private acts. The letter claimed his camera coverage was an invasion of privacy, a claim that resonated with the few neighbors who valued solitude over transparency. For a nerve-centered moment, the conflict seemed to pivot away from stolen goods to the right to record in one's own public space. Mark's response was meticulous. He posted the law, state statutes about public recording, next to the footage in a way that could not be misconstrued. He spoke with a city attorney not for theatrics, but to ensure that his actions remained within legal boundaries. He offered mediation to the HOA with the condition that all parties review the raw footage together, with counsel present. His calm proceduralism was disarmingly effective. It neutralized several smear attempts and put the narrative back on evidence, not innuendo. Still, Karen had not yet revealed her most destabilizing maneuver. Frustration had metastasized into vindictiveness. Late one night, a set of packages legitimately addressed to elderly neighbors disappeared. The small parcels contained prescription refills and household supplies. When the recipients flagged them, the police were finally drawn into the pattern. This particular shift moved the incident from petty theft into criminal territory, and the facade of garden lady respectability began to show cracks that even her fiercest apologists could not gloss over. By the time the officers requested to view Mark's entire security feed, the neighborhood had reached a new low point in civic health, yet an equilibrium of sorts in moral clarity. The footage, when reviewed by law enforcement, confirmed a broader pattern that extended beyond the single glitter box. Documentation from Mark, matched with the recovered items from Karen's discarded refuse, gave investigators the corroboration they needed. But the story was not yet finished. Karen's options were dwindling and her pride, bruised to the point of obsession, would not vanish quietly. The cold sack had shifted from gossip and petty enforcement to a complicated theater of accountability. Mark had turned the camera on theft, and in doing so, turned neighbors into witnesses, jurors, and participants in a drama neither side could fully control. The trap had worked. The glitter was only the beginning, and as the police opened their case file, everyone in the street could sense the tectonic shift that would follow. The days after the police visit marked a new phase in the battle. The once idyllic street, with its trimmed hedges and porch swings, had become a living map of divided loyalties. The neighborhood that once prided itself on unity now pulsed with tension and whispered theories. Mark, who had started this as a private act of justice, found himself at the center of something far larger, an unintentional crusade against hypocrisy, secrecy, and entitlement. In his garage, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights illuminated what would come to be called the evidence wall. It began as a corkboard filled with timelines and photos, but soon expanded into a mosaic of printouts, screenshots, and handwritten notes. Each string of red yarn represented a connection package, timestamps, footage angles, complaint letters, and even screenshots of Karen's social media posts. The board was not for obsession, it was for clarity. Mark knew that to outlast Karen he needed facts, not fury. Meanwhile, Karen's composure had begun to unravel behind closed doors. Her pristine lawn was still immaculate, but the blinds stayed drawn longer each morning. Her Facebook posts became erratic, a mixture of victimhood sanctimony and half-coded accusations about stalkers and predators hiding behind cameras. The same neighbors who once deferred to her as the unspoken enforcer of neighborhood standards now avoided her driveway entirely. Her small circle of allies began to shrink, though none dared to confront her directly. The HOA, sensing that the situation was veering into uncontrollable scandal, held an emergency meeting. Mark wasn't invited at first, but when word leaked that law enforcement had confirmed multiple thefts, the board reluctantly called him in. The room was tense. The faint smell of coffee couldn't disguise the unease. The members wanted the issue gone, erased, replaced by silence and seasonal decorations. But Mark's evidence made that impossible. The HOA had no choice but to acknowledge that one of their own members, the very woman who had chaired committees and enforced fines, was now the prime suspect in a string of thefts. For Mark, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth and the strange satisfaction that comes from watching order unravel under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Still, he knew better than to underestimate Karen. Her type didn't surrender, they recalibrated, and recalibrate she did. Within days, a formal letter arrived from her attorney, demanding that Mark remove all online content featuring her likeness and threatening a defamation suit. The letter accused him of malicious surveillance and character destruction. It was dense, sharp, and intimidating, designed to break him down with legal noise. For a moment, it worked. Mark lay awake that night, staring at the soft glow of the evidence wall, feeling the pressure of consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. But the facts were his armor. He spent the next morning at the police station, calmly reviewing the footage with officers, confirming timestamps, and reaffirming his legal right to record activity on his property. The detectives, while careful with their language, made it clear his evidence wasn't harassment. It was documentation of criminal behavior. Karen's lawsuit threat would collapse the moment those clips entered Discovery. That evening, the wind picked up, scattering orange leaves across the deep sack. Mark stood outside, watching Karen's silhouette move behind her curtains, pacing like a caged animal. She had started parking her car at odd angles, as if to obscure the view from his cameras. But she couldn't hide her anger. Every small act of defiance, her trash bins left deliberately in front of his driveway, the way she hosed the street at sunrise, was a performance of resentment. Then came the knock. A quiet, almost reluctant tap at Mark's door. It was one of the older residents, a man who had lived on the street long before the OA existed. He spoke in careful tones, explaining that he'd seen Karen near the mailbox cluster again, this time rifling through envelopes that weren't hers. He didn't want to be involved, he said, but enough is enough. Mark thanked him and noted the date on a notepad. Another entry for the wall. Word spread quickly after that. Others came forward, quietly, privately. One neighbor admitted that a small Amazon parcel had gone missing weeks earlier, but she hadn't wanted to, 'cause drama. Another confessed that Karen had once offered to hold a package while they were out of town, only for it to disappear entirely. Each confession filled another square on the wall. Karen, cornered by truth, switched tactics again. She filed a formal harassment report of her own, claiming that Mark was targeting her with cameras, drones, and neighborhood gossip. But when investigators arrived to inspect his system, they found nothing out of bounds. No drones, no hidden mics, only a series of well-positioned security cameras pointing strictly at his property. The officers left politely, with faint smiles that hinted at disbelief. Karen's plan had failed again. Still, the story had grown legs. Local gossip channels picked it up. A Reddit thread titled, "Neighborhood Karen Caught on Camera Stealing Packages," went viral, complete with Mark's footage. While Mark had not shared it publicly, someone from the police report apparently had. The video spread fast, too fast for anyone to contain it. Karen's face, frozen mid-theft, became an internet meme. Humiliation turned into obsession. She began scouring the neighborhood at night, collecting mail, trash, and anything that might contain her name. Some said she was trying to find out who leaked the footage, others believed she was preparing to move. But Mark noticed something more concerning. She started documenting him, too. Her phone camera appeared in her window, tracking his comings and goings, perhaps in some futile attempt to build a counter case. The HOA grew desperate to end the spectacle. They drafted a motion to suspend her membership and revoke her privileges, a symbolic act meant to show neutrality. Karen attended the hearing, wearing sunglasses indoors, radiating contempt. She didn't speak, but the venom in her silence was louder than any accusation. When the vote passed, she stood abruptly and left, her heels echoing across the tile like a gavel strike. That was the last time most neighbors saw her in person. Her blinds closed permanently, and her car disappeared for long stretches. Some said she was consulting lawyers, others believed she was preparing something far more dramatic. Mark, meanwhile, began restoring his peace. The packages resumed their quiet arrivals. Deliveries were once again safe, neighbors waved more often, and the tension eased. But something about the calm felt artificial, too quiet, too clean. Late one night, as he reviewed his footage, Mark noticed a flicker in the corner of the frame movement at the edge of his property line. A figure, low and cloaked in shadow, approached his porch and paused near one of the cameras. Then, abruptly, the feed cut to black. The system rebooted seconds later. The porch was empty, but the faint outline of a shoe print gleamed under the porch light, muddy, deliberate, and fresh. Whatever Karen was planning next, it was no longer about packages. It was about revenge. The night the camera feed went dark marked the turning point, the moment when annoyance evolved into something darker, more personal. What began as a neighborhood dispute over stolen packages had spiraled into a quiet psychological war. For Mark, sleep became a fragile thing, fractured by every creak of the floorboards and flicker of security lights. His once simple suburban home now felt like a fortress under siege. In the morning, he checked the footage again. The system's automatic reboot had restored most files, but 2 full minutes were missing, a gap that shouldn't have been possible. His tech-savvy friend later confirmed that the cameras hadn't malfunctioned, someone had deliberately jammed the signal. That someone had to have been close enough to access the Wi-Fi range, and that meant Karen. Outside, the footprint still lingered, faint but undeniable. He photographed it, compared it to older images, and found a match. Karen's garden shoes, the same ones visible in older footage when she was caught on camera taking the first package. The evidence was piling up again, but this time it wasn't about theft. It was about intrusion. The days that followed grew heavier, almost theatrical in their tension. The neighborhood carried on as usual. Sprinklers ticking, mail trucks humming, children biking home from school. But beneath the surface, everyone knew something was wrong. Even the HOA board members avoided eye contact when they saw Mark. They were tired of the spectacle, eager to bury it. Yet the story had escaped their control long ago. Karen's house became a monument of silence. Her blinds stayed sealed, her yard unnaturally still. The Halloween decorations that had once adorned her porch were gone, replaced by emptiness. It wasn't peace, it was retreat. But retreat did not mean surrender. Mark knew that from the way her porch light blinked sporadically at night, as if coded, or how strange cars occasionally appeared outside her driveway only to vanish minutes later. Then, around midnight one Thursday, the visitor returned. It began with the faint crunch of gravel outside his window. Mark had been reviewing footage again, the blue glow of his monitors reflecting in his eyes, when a motion alert popped up, front yard movement. He clicked open the live feed. A shadow drifted across the edge of his property line. At first, it looked like a trick of light, a passing cat perhaps. But then the figure straightened. The outline was unmistakably human. The figure moved closer, deliberate and unhurried, as though testing his reaction. They paused near the front porch camera, the same one that had gone dark before, and tilted their head upward, staring directly into the lens. For one chilling second, the system flickered again, distorting the image into a ghostly blur. When it returned, the figure was gone. Mark rushed outside, flashlight in hand. The street was empty except for the wind. Yet near his mailbox, something glimmered faintly in the beam, a torn envelope. He bent down and recognized the handwriting, his name. But it wasn't his mail. It belonged to a neighbor 2 houses down. That was the message. Karen was reminding him she could still reach anywhere she wanted. Over the next few days, he noticed smaller, subtler acts. His garbage cans were overturned one morning, contents scattered neatly across the driveway. A single dead plant appeared on his porch the next. Each incident was designed not to harm, but to unsettle. And it worked. Even his dog, normally calm, began barking at nothing during the night. Yet Mark refused to respond. Instead, he upgraded his cameras, doubling coverage, installing hidden motion detectors along the perimeter, even placing discrete infrared sensors that would trigger silent alerts. This time, he wouldn't just catch her, he would end this. The following weekend, he got his chance. At exactly 30:14 a.m., the alert went off again. The same camera, the same shadow. But this time, the system didn't cut. It recorded in full clarity. The figure stepped onto his porch wearing a hooded jacket and gloves. She moved with purpose, crouching near the doorbell camera holding something metallic, a screwdriver. She was trying to disable it. The motion light flared, revealing her face. Karen. For a moment, she froze, eyes wide, mouth tight, before bolting across the lawn. Mark watched from behind the blinds, adrenaline surging. The cameras tracked her path perfectly, capturing her sprint toward her own property and disappearing into the side gate. By sunrise, he had already submitted the footage to the authorities. There was no denying it now. Trespassing, attempted vandalism, and the theft connection still open. The police, who had once tread lightly around the suburban politics of the case, now had no choice but to act. Later that afternoon, a patrol car rolled slowly down the street. Karen's car was parked out front, motionless. When the officers knocked, no one answered. They circled the house, exchanged brief words, and finally left with official notices taped to her door. The neighborhood watched in silence. No one spoke of it directly, but the sense of collective relief was palpable. For the first time in months, Mark felt the air lighten. He could finally take a deep breath. But beneath the calm, a small detail gnawed at him: the missing footage. Those 2 vanished minutes from the night the system was jammed. That night, he reviewed all the old backups. Every clip, every timestamp, every file. And that's when he saw it, not in the video itself, but in the logs. A secondary IP address had accessed his camera feed remotely during the outage. Not Karen's, but something routed through another device entirely. Someone else had been watching. Whether it was one of her acquaintances, someone she'd hired, or just another neighbor feeding off the drama, he didn't know. But the implication was clear. This wasn't just Karen's obsession anymore. It had grown beyond her control, spreading like wildfire across digital spaces and community gossip threads. The suburban conflict that had started with stolen boxes had become a kind of spectacle, a modern morality play unfolding behind picket fences. And somewhere out there, unseen eyes were still watching, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Mark turned off his monitors that night, but sleep never came. The wind outside whispered against the windows, soft but persistent, as though carrying the faint echo of laughter, high-pitched, mocking, unmistakably hers. The war wasn't over. It was only getting stranger. By the time the weekend ended, the neighborhood's fragile calm had shattered again. The footage of Karen caught on camera had spread faster than wildfire. Someone, likely one of the neighbors Mark had shown the proof to, had leaked a screenshot online. Within hours, it was posted on local community pages, discussed in Facebook groups, and whispered about in every cul-de-sac. Karen's reputation, once protected by her position on the HOA board and her carefully maintained facade, was collapsing in real time. The same people who once nodded politely at her were now avoiding eye contact. Others, bolder and angrier, openly mocked her. A few even commented on Mark's social posts, congratulating him for finally taking down the neighborhood tyrant. But Karen wasn't done. Public humiliation didn't make her retreat. It made her desperate. The first sign came quietly. A letter slipped into Mark's mailbox, handwritten and unsigned. The paper was crumpled, the ink smudged, but the words were sharp. It accused him of defamation, of setting her up, and warned that the HOA would make an example of him. He recognized her phrasing immediately, the same kind of self-righteous tone she had used in her endless HOA complaints. Mark laughed bitterly at first, tossing it aside. But within days, the threats evolved. Official-looking envelopes began arriving, each bearing the OA's seal. One demanded a fine for unapproved exterior surveillance equipment. Another cited him for non-conforming lawn ornaments, a reference to the small garden gnome his daughter had placed near the mailbox. And then came the most absurd, a notice ordering him to remove the driveway modifications he had never made. Karen was trying to weaponize the HOA against him again. The rest of the board was caught in the middle. Some members sympathized with Mark, having grown tired of Karen's power plays, but others were terrified of crossing her. For weeks, the HOA meetings became a silent battleground, neighbors choosing sides without speaking, agendas rewritten at the last minute, and tensions so thick you could feel them through the blinds. Mark, however, wasn't content to play defense. He had learned enough by now to understand that Karen thrived on intimidation. The only way to stop her was to expose her completely, to bring every dirty tactic into the light. He began compiling a dossier. Copies of every letter, every fine, every screenshot. He backed up the security footage, including the timestamp logs showing unauthorized access. He gathered statements from neighbors she had harassed. Families fined for Christmas lights, gardeners cited for unauthorized soil colors, homeowners threatened for planting sunflowers. By the time he was done, his evidence filled an entire folder, neatly labeled HOA abuse. Exhibit A. Then, quietly, he contacted a lawyer. The attorney listened patiently as Mark explained everything. When the story ended, the lawyer's response was simple. You've got more than enough. They drafted a cease and desist order for harassment and an official complaint to the county's housing authority, complete with all the documented violations. Once filed, it would go directly to the oversight body that monitored HOA misconduct. But before the paperwork could be finalized, Karen made her most reckless move yet. Late one Friday evening, as a storm rolled over the neighborhood, Mark's power flickered. He assumed it was weather-related until he heard a crash outside. He rushed to the porch, flashlight in hand, and froze. His mailbox was lying on the ground, torn from its post. Splinters littered the sidewalk. And there, illuminated by the storm's lightning flash, stood Karen. Her hair clung to her face, soaked through. Her expression was wild, eyes wide with fury. She shouted something indistinct, her voice drowned by thunder, but her meaning was unmistakable. She was unraveling. By the time police arrived, she was gone. They took statements, examined the damage, and promised to document the incident. But Mark could tell from their tone that they were tired of her name. She had called them so many times over the years that they no longer treated her as a credible source of trouble. The next morning, however, things escalated again. Karen's front yard was empty, no car, no decorations, nothing. Her blinds were drawn, and taped to her front door was a county notice property under investigation. Rumors spread faster than ever. Some claimed she had been fined for code violations. Others whispered that she was facing criminal charges for trespassing and vandalism. A few even said she had been forced to resign from the HOA board entirely. Mark didn't celebrate. Not yet. He'd seen how unpredictable she could be when cornered. And sure enough, a few nights later, the real revenge arrived, not in person but online. A fake social media page appeared under Mark's name. It posted bizarre rants about neighbors, uploaded edited photos, and even made false accusations about the HOA. Within hours, several residents had seen it. Some realized it was fake, others weren't sure. Karen's fingerprints were all over it. The style, the phrasing, the obsession with control. But what she hadn't realized was that digital footprints never truly vanish. Using his tech contact, Mark traced the origin of the posts back to an IP address, one that matched Karen's own network. The proof was airtight. He added it to his growing file and turned everything over to his lawyer. Within a week, the official complaint reached the county. Within 2, the HOA board received notice of a formal investigation. And within 3, Karen's reign over the neighborhood was effectively finished. She was suspended from all HOA duties pending review. Her attempts to appeal were rejected. Her allies on the board resigned quietly to avoid being dragged down with her. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt normal. Kids played in driveways again. Neighbors waved instead of whispering. Even the endless chain of hour notices stopped appearing in mailboxes. Mark's security system stayed quiet. The air felt lighter, as if the whole community had exhaled after months of holding its breath. But there was one final twist. One evening, as Mark sat on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the sunset, he noticed a car parked halfway down the street. The same model as Karen's, but darker. It sat there for nearly 20 minutes, engine idling, headlights off. Then it slowly drove away. He checked his cameras that night. Nothing unusual, just that fleeting image. But he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't gone. Not really. People like her rarely vanished completely. They just waited for the next opportunity. And as the cicadas sang into the evening and the streetlights flickered on, Mark realized something quietly unnerving. His story, the one he thought was finally over, had already started spreading online again. His videos, his posts, even clips from his doorbell footage were being shared by strangers. The drama that had consumed his neighborhood was now public entertainment. Weeks passed, and the once chaotic neighborhood began settling into a strange rhythm. With Karen gone, the HOA transformed from an oppressive force into what it was always meant to be, a simple community association. The constant barrage of fines, warnings, and intimidation evaporated overnight. People painted their doors new colors, kids played chalk games on the sidewalks without fear of citations, and laughter, something long absent, returned to the cold D-Sacks. But for Mark, peace still came with a shadow. He couldn't ignore the nagging sense that the storm wasn't truly over. The night he saw that car, the one he swore was Karen's, replayed in his mind over and over. He checked his cameras daily, verified every strange sound, every flicker of movement. For a man who had fought back so hard for his freedom, he now found himself unable to rest easy. Then, one morning, a letter arrived, no postage, no sender's name, just a white envelope wedged beneath his front door. Inside was a single line written in her familiar looping handwriting. "You may have won the battle, but I never lose." His stomach turned cold. He showed the note to his lawyer, who advised him to report it, and he did. The police logged it as potential harassment. Though without fingerprints or evidence, there was little they could do. It was a small act, but enough to reignite the tension that had haunted the neighborhood for nearly a year. Still, Mark refused to let it undo everything. If Karen wanted to play her games again, she would face the full force of her own consequences this time. He kept his cameras active, stayed alert, and went about his days as normally as possible. Meanwhile, the HOA's investigation into Karen's misconduct reached its conclusion. The findings were scathing. The report documented years of abuse of power, unjust fines, personal vendettas, misuse of HOA funds, and clear violations of residents' rights. The board voted unanimously to ban her from holding any HOA office ever again. Fines were issued, restitution was ordered, and the county imposed a permanent injunction preventing her from interfering with community matters. It was, in every sense, a total defeat. But as with all bullies, Karen didn't vanish quietly. Her house went up for sale, and though it lingered on the market for months, she eventually managed to find a buyer. A young couple, blissfully unaware of the neighborhood's turbulent history. The day the moving trucks came, Mark watched from his driveway. There she was, hair tied up, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, giving quick instructions to the movers. Even from a distance, he could sense the bitterness in her movements, the tightness of her jaw, the way she refused to look in his direction. And then, at last, she was gone. That night, the neighborhood threw what could only be described as a celebration. People brought food. Kids ran around waving sparklers, and for the first time in years, laughter echoed freely through the streets. It wasn't just about her leaving. It was about reclaiming their sense of community. Mark became something of a quiet legend among his neighbors, the man who had stood up to the tyrant and won. He never bragged about it, but word spread anyway, even beyond the neighborhood. The video clips of his story, the evidence, the security footage, all of it had gone viral online. He was receiving interview requests, local news interest, and even offers from HOA reform advocates who wanted him to share his story. He decided to tell it, not for fame, but as a warning. He spoke about accountability, about standing up against unfair authority, and about how communities could protect themselves from people who abused power. His calm, reasoned tone made an impression. What had begun as petty neighborhood drama was now an example of justice done right. But beneath all the praise, Mark never lost his edge. He remained cautious. He double-checked his cameras, reviewed his alerts, and kept that one letter. The last trace of Karen, sealed in a drawer, just in case. Months passed peacefully, and life slowly returned to normal. The seasons changed, the lawns grew and were cut without drama, and the HOA meetings became refreshingly boring. New members were elected, and the board focused on community picnics, local repairs, and actual improvements instead of nitpicking aesthetics. Then, one crisp autumn morning, something unexpected happened. A package appeared on Mark's porch. There was no return label, only his name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper, was a single object, a small ceramic mailbox. It was nearly identical to his own, down to the fine cracks in the paint. Taped to the bottom was a note that read simply, "Thought you might miss me." For a long moment, he stood frozen. Then he looked up and scanned the street, empty, silent. The sun glinted off the neighboring windows, casting harmless reflections, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He placed the figurine in his garage, shut the door, and sat on his workbench in silence. He thought about everything that had happened. The power struggles, the letters, the fear, the small victories that had turned into something much larger. He realized that while he had won, Karen had achieved something too. She had forced him to live differently. More aware, more guarded, more deliberate. But as he looked around the garage, his sanctuary now transformed into a place of peace filled with projects, tools, and reminders of the life he had built despite her. He felt something stronger than fear. He felt pride. Karen might linger as a ghost in the story, a shadow in the corner of his memories, but she no longer controlled the narrative. He did. Weeks later, he donated the ceramic mailbox to the HOA clubhouse, where it was placed on a shelf marked Community Artifacts. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. People laughed every time they walked past it, joking about the legend of Karen. And eventually, even those jokes faded, replaced by new memories, better ones. Years down the line, Mark's neighborhood became known for something else entirely. Not for its rules or its conflicts, but for its resilience. Every Halloween, every block party, every time someone put up decorations that once might have been banned, there was a shared understanding. They'd earned their freedom together. And as for Mark, he finally stopped checking his cameras every night, because some battles, once truly won, never need to be fought again.